All right, so before we dive into stormwater, I did want to offer a couple of clarifications on the drinking water presentation yesterday because we had a couple of questions that we didn't answer. First, there was this distinction between community and non-community systems because there was the question, typically a community system is referring to a municipality, a town, a homeowners association dealing with supplying water to residents. Which we said, if you read in the regulations, the non-transient, non-community typically lists schools under it. But as I started thinking about that, we have dorms, and so those are residences. So if you have a drinking water system and you're supplying to dorms, you are actually supplying to residences. So I made a call this morning to EPD to check, and if you do have your own drinking water system and you have dorms and you're supplying them drinking water, you are considered a community drinking water system. So we've got that one. And the second question had to do with if you are receiving drinking water from a municipality, it's already treated, it's ready to be drunk as is, but you decide to do some filtering anyway. You just run it through a filter before it goes into your system. They're saying that is considered treatment. They said that you're altering the characteristics from what you originally receive it, and you would be subject to the drinking water regulations. So I think that contradicts an interpretation someone else had. So if you're in this situation, I would suggest talking to maybe Alex and find out how you want to approach getting the interpretation from your regulator. I'm not saying go out right now and identify yourself and say this is what you're doing, but I think you need to sort of wrap that up because we've got a couple different interpretations now. Okay, so we're ready to move on to stormwater? Okay, excellent. So let me turn this over this way a little bit. We've got 3 different water presentations that we're going to go through this morning. The first is stormwater. And does anyone here have a stormwater permit that you know of related to any activities on campus? Okay. Okay, so a couple people might. Some of these things you might actually have these permits, perhaps they might be managed by your facilities department if they're in relation to a construction project. So it could be something like that. Well, we'll find out about which ones could potentially apply. So what we'll be covering first, here's sort of the agenda. We'll go through the federal stormwater program, give you a couple of definitions to set the background for what we'll be discussing. Npdes, National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System, is the program and the permits we're talking about, a 2-phase program. Georgia's stormwater regulations. Again, Georgia's delegated authority to manage and permit for stormwater in the state. MS4 permitting, which is municipal separate storm sewer system. Construction permitting and stormwater audit points. So first of all, this is the Clean Water Act program. And the Clean Water Act prohibits discharges associated with industrial activity from a point source. And all of these orange terms we'll be describing and defining as we go on. Provides that stormwater discharges associated with industrial activity from a point source, including discharges through a municipal separate storm sewer system, to waters of the state are unlawful unless they're issued through a Npdes permit. Npdes regulations are 40 CFR 122 and 123. As I mentioned, Georgia has authority here in the state to operate the program. EPD is a permitting authority and provides both general and specific individual Npdes permit. And we'll describe the difference between those 2 types in a moment. So first of all, what is stormwater runoff? It seems pretty obvious. And it occurs naturally. It's basically you get too much precipitation coming down for it to automatically percolate into the ground, so you have water running over the surface of the land. As it does that, it picks up sediment, soil, other kinds of pollutants, and can put them into receiving water bodies. Again, this happens naturally. What the regulations are designed to prevent is any additional sort of erosion from happening to add to what we already have going on, because you end up with things like stream bank erosion, excess siltation, and things like that. So point source. Npdes permits are regulating point source discharges. So what that means is your pollutant, your stormwater, is coming from a particular conveyance. It may be a pipe, it may be a drainage swale, it could be a ditch, but there's a discernible discharge. And this is opposed to something which would be a sheet flow, where there is no sort of collection system. The water just sort of flows off the surface, not into any particular conveyance. So if there's a discernible discharge, it's considered a point source. Waters of the state, again, we've got big, long definitions, but it's important because if your discharge is not going to waters of the state, it's not regulated under the program. So as we read through this, what the definition includes are all rivers, streams, creeks, branches, lakes, reservoirs, ponds, drainage systems, springs, wells, wetlands, and other bodies of surface or subsurface groundwater, natural or artificial, lying within or forming a part of the boundaries of the state, which are not entirely confined and retained completely upon the property of a single private owner. So if you have a pond that's only on your property and there's a discharge to it, it's not regulated. If that pond is on shared property, it could be. And again, as you see here, there's a huge variety of water bodies, just about anything you could think of, above ground and below ground, that is covered by the definition of waters of the state. That would be waters of the state because it's not completely contained on your property. Okay. So the first portion of permitting that we're going to talk about deals with the municipal separate storm sewer systems, or MS4s. There are a few different categories of MS4s, but what an MS4 is, and some of you may be MS4s, it's a conveyance or a system of conveyances, which is waters, roads, drainage systems, catch basins, curbs, gutters, ditches, anything that's directing stormwater, owned or operated by a public entity designed and used for collecting and conveying stormwater that is not a combined sewer or part of a POTW. And what that last part means is most entities are going to have separate sewer systems and separate stormwater collection systems. Separate pipings, they all go their own separate ways. Some areas do have combined sanitary and stormwater sewer systems, so that your rainwater runoff and your sanitary sewer from your buildings all flows through the same system and goes through a POTW. If that's the case, if you have a combined system and all of that water is going to a POTW, a publicly owned treatment works, wastewater treatment plant, you're not an MS4. But if your stormwater collection system is separate and distinct from your sanitary, your stormwater collection has its own system, it's being discharged somewhere on campus and eventually getting to a water body without going through a POTW, then you could potentially be an MS4. And the three different categories of MS4, and again that's municipal separate storm sewer system, are large MS4s that have populations greater than 250,000, and medium, which have between 100 and 250,000, and then small MS4s, which is where you could potentially come in, which is any MS4 that does not fit into large or medium. And we'll talk a little bit more about this in a second, but first let me say that it says municipal separate storm sewer system, and so of course you think a town, a municipality. But the term is also defined to include these sorts of entities as well: state colleges and universities, military bases, prisons, large hospitals, other state agencies. So that's how you can get pulled in through the actual definition of what an MS4 is. So a little bit of background on the permitting before we go into the couple of kinds of permits that could apply to your campuses is that EPA developed the stormwater permitting program in two phases. Phase 1 started in 1990, and then Phase 2 about 2000. And we don't have to go through all of these pieces because we're going to cover the pertinent ones going forward. But you'll hear about the Phase 1 permit regulations and the Phase 2 permit regulations, and this is what it's referring to. Back up. The two different stages in which these permitting programs were implemented. So the Phase 1. Typically, these Phase 1 permit programs are not going to apply to a college or university campus. They cover stormwater discharges associated with industrial activity, and those are based upon a facility's SIC code. Stormwater discharges to the large or medium municipal systems, which again are that 100,000 population or greater, and stormwater discharges from large construction projects. Those that disturb 5 or more acres of land at a time. So, right, occasionally I guess it could if you had a very large project.
2 to 3 years during a large building construction.
So most construction projects probably don't exceed 5 acres, but if you have a really big development going on, certainly that could occur. And that was Phase 1 back from 1990. Now, Phase 2 expanded the program and started to pull in a lot of the other smaller regulated entities. So what we ended up with were, again, the small MS4s in urbanized areas. Small MS4s being anything that fit that definition of MS4 that was not medium or large, and in an urbanized area. Urbanized areas are designated by the Census Bureau, and you can go to EPA's website and they have maps that show you what the designated urbanized areas are. So what that means is if you're a public entity and you're in one of these designated urbanized areas, then you're considered a small MS4. The second regulation change for the Phase 2 was small construction projects. So now if your construction project is 1 acre or larger and is disturbing land, then it's covered by this permit program. And the third piece are stormwater discharges from industrial activities for small municipal facilities. But you're moving earth.
You're moving
It's disturbing
so
land.
you're only moving an inch here.
About the only time this wouldn't apply is if you're in the middle of a downtown area and you're working in a totally concentrated area, there's nothing around you. Or if all of your activities were completely within a building, you had massive buildings, you have building larger than neighbors, certainly. But otherwise, if you're doing any sort of land disturbing activities where there's potential for runoff and erosion, sediment to be released from rainwaters, then you're subject to this. So as I mentioned, there are 2 types of permits that can be applied for under the stormwater program and that EPD issues. First are individual permits, which are designed particularly for a specific project, a specific entity. And the second are general permits. And their general permits are available for industrial activities, for MS4s, and for construction projects. And EPD and EPA and most states have these general permits for like types of projects. Because if you can imagine, there are hundreds of new construction projects that disturb 1 acre or more of land going on in the state at any one time, multiple hundreds. So EPD doesn't have the resources to read everything, look at the criteria, and issue individual permits for all of these. And plus, they all have similar characteristics. You're going to need similar controls in place. So a general permit is out there. And we'll talk a little bit more about how that permit works and how you comply with it. But if you fit the criteria for a general permit for any specific categories, industrial, MS4, construction, then you can apply for coverage under the general permit. If your discharge doesn't fit into one of these categories, then you may need to apply for an individual use permit. Well, you could be under the MS4 program. And again, that's if you're a state institution, which you are, and if you're in one of those designated urbanized areas. From our discussions last night at dinner and talking about your little town, I doubt you're in a designated urbanized area, but you would want to check the maps to make sure of that. So some facilities here will and some won't, and you could be having the exact same activities going on in your campus, but it depends on where you're located. If you're in one of the designated urban areas, even if you're not doing any construction, you're not doing anything in particular, you're a small MS4 in that area, then you're in the program. So the types of general permits that could potentially apply are, we've got the general permit for small MS4s. I'm going to talk about that one a little bit more. And then there's a general permit for construction activities. This particular number, GAR 100001, is for individual construction projects. There are 2 other types of construction general permits that are less likely to apply on a campus. One is for infrastructure projects that are conducted by an infrastructure contractor, and then the other one are for common development construction projects, where you have multiple construction projects going on at the same site on different schedules. Most of the time, the activities that you have, if they're subject to the construction permitting, will be under this individual permit. The other type of general permit, the industrial activity permit that we discussed, is unlikely to apply in most campuses because, again, this is based upon SIC code for particular kinds of activities. But there is a chance that it could, because some of the activities covered, for example, are hospitals. So if you were a campus that had a hospital, it was yours and you operated it, you could potentially be subject to the industrial stormwater permitting for that. The other one is, oh, I'm sorry, let me back up. I'm talking pre-treatment. Scratch that hospital comment. The kinds of things that are under the industrial activity permit, which could be going on at a campus, are landfills, and I know that at least one campus has a landfill, and steam electric generating facilities. So if you have one of those, you could potentially be subject to the industrial permitting. I don't think that's going to affect many people, though. So here we're going to talk a little bit more about the MS4 category and what that means. Again, campuses are publicly funded entities. They're located, if they're located in urbanized areas and they discharge to a separate storm sewer system, not that combined system, then they are subject to the general permitting requirement. This is inaccurate, where it says you already should have received coverage. And this, I'll help explain Arthur's question. They have in place right now a general permit for small MS4s. This permit is really geared toward the municipalities, like you're talking about. If you're in a designated one, the town probably already has one. And they probably already do. They're covered under this permit right here. But EPD realized that that permit was geared toward towns and municipalities, and that the things that you need to comply with in it don't really apply to state agencies, to prisons, to hospitals, to colleges and universities. So what they've done is they're kind of backing away and developing separate targeted permits for those types of agencies. So far, the only one they've gotten beyond this general one for the municipalities is Department of Defense facilities. They have their own general permit that they can get coverage under. They're in the process of developing one right now for other state agencies, which you would fall into. It's not in place right now, so you can't apply for one. So if you are a small MS4 in a designated urbanized area, you are subject to the program, but they don't currently have a permit available for you. She said it would probably be a couple of years out because it's a slow process. So you're not currently in non-compliance if you haven't applied for a permit, but you want to check and see if you're in one of these areas, and eventually you'll be pulled into the program. So your question, Arthur, the town is going to have their own permit, and they're probably going to be covered under this. But you are a separately regulated entity. So again, they're making a permit just for your type of facility that makes sense for you. Right, it doesn't really matter what's going into your stormwater, it's just sort of, if you're that public entity in that designated area, then you're in the program. And do we talk about that? Let's see where we are. Oh, I skipped over. Nope. Okay. So the general permit for small MS4s, once they do make this permit available for you, to let you know how it will work, what you'll do is you'll submit a notice of intent for coverage. Fill out an application for it, let them know what you're doing, what sorts of activities you have, where you're located, and let them know that you're seeking coverage under the general permit. You prepare a stormwater management plan, SWMP, and you'll implement it over the 5-year period of the permit, assuming they continue to issue these permits at 5-year intervals. And then prepare an annual report that has to go to EPD each year describing your progress in in reaching the goals that you set in your permit. In a minute, you'll see what the goals are. So there's certain discharges that are not covered under the MS4 permit. Again, this is geared toward one specific kind of general, just we're watching what goes into the stormwater system and making sure there's nothing going in there that shouldn't, and letting people know how they need to manage the system. These are all not covered under this MS4 permit. So if you have these types of discharges, you may have to seek coverage under a different kind of stormwater permit, such as an industrial permit or construction permit. And the activities are stormwater discharges associated with industrial activity, discharges that enter waters of the state other than from a point source, so if you have some sort of sheet flow discharge, discharges from construction sites with 1 acre or more of disturbed land, because that's under the construction general permit, and Npdes permitted non-stormwater discharges. These are things that would require an individual permit, sort of process or waste discharges to waters of the state. So these are not covered. So if you do have to get coverage under the MS4 permit and you have to develop a stormwater management plan, these are the sorts of things you're taking into consideration, and this is what they want you to look at and try to deal with and head off potential problems with. They have 6 minimum control measures that you have to discuss in your plan and create measurable goals toward achieving progress toward implementing. First is public education and outreach on stormwater impacts. So that what that is relating to your community, which is basically the campus community. If you were in a town, it would be all the residents of the town. But here it's the students, the faculty, the staff, people who are living and working on campus. Let them know about stormwater impacts. I mean, one of the biggest problems is people see that catch basin in the ground. They don't really know where that goes. They may think that goes to the POTW, so it's not a big deal if I just dump something in there. It'll go to the treatment plant. But your catch basins may not. They may not realize that dumping something into that catch basin is essentially the same as dumping it into the river down the street. Public involvement, participation piece, illicit discharge detection and elimination. They want you to take a whole look at your campus and make sure that you don't have floor drains or any sort of other polluting activities going into your stormwater system. Construction site stormwater runoff control touches on that a little bit, general things you need to put in place. Post-construction management criteria, and then pollution prevention and good housekeeping for municipal operations. And these are typically things like street sweeping on a regular basis to make sure that you don't have excess debris going into catch basins, cleaning out catch basins and outfalls, making sure that people know what can and cannot go down the drains, not applying pesticides during rain events. Those are the sort of good housekeeping practices that you would implement under this Stormwater Management Plan program. But again, this is all on hold right now for state agencies. If you have the MS4 permit, other things you have to do, again, that annual report to EPD. There may be monitoring, but typically not, and records. Any sort of records related to this, any sort of inspections you do, your annual reports you need to keep for 3 years. So now the construction permit. And again, this construction permit, and I know a lot of campuses seem to have continuous construction going on, so probably somewhere, most of your campuses may have one of these in effect right now. If you're disturbing 1 or more acres of land, you need this general construction permit. The owner or the operator is responsible for getting this. And in this program, the primary permittee can be the owner, which would be the campus, the operator, which would probably be the general contractor who's managing the day-to-day activities of the site, or both. So it depends on how you define it in your relationship and who has the responsibility for doing this. So the college rents property from someone else, but you're having a parking lot put in the property.
That's right, like a gravel parking lot, but you still need to grade that area.
You're probably, again, you've probably got all 3 folks now involved as potentially responsible people. And anytime anyone has a potential responsibility, you need to make sure that somebody is taking care of the requirement, and that should be clearly designated as to who's going to be responsible for all of these things. And if it is the operator, if it is going to be the construction company and not the campus, you need to make sure this is being done, and it's really a good idea to get copies of these records, get copies of the NOI and all of the stormwater pollution prevention plans and things that are put into place. But what you will do is to get coverage under this general permit, because again, they're not issuing individual permits to people. There's a permit that's out there, it's on the website right now, tells you what you need to do to comply to be under this permit. You just submit a notification to EPD saying, I want to seek coverage under this permit. You have to submit it at least 14 days prior to the start of your project, and if you don't hear back from EPD, you assume you're covered. They're not going to send you something back typically unless there's a problem with your NOI. So you're automatically covered. After you submit the NOI, or prior to submitting it, but before doing any of the construction activity, you have to develop and implement an erosion, sedimentation, and pollution control plan. This has to be created by a, a design professional licensed in Georgia. So that professional could be an engineer, it could be an architect, landscape architect, geologist, a few other different categories. They have to develop this plan for the site. And then when the project is complete, when final stabilization has occurred, all the vegetation's in place, you have to submit a notice of termination to EPD to let them know the project is finished. If there's some sort of commonality to them, if they're being done by the same company and overseen by the same group, I think it makes sense to put them under one permit. If they're completely distinct, then that would be very difficult to do, if there's separate controls, separate people running the operations. But if it's all being done under the same control, I think you want to put it under one. It'd be much easier to manage.
You know, it'd be kind of difficult because they'd have to end at the same time. You'd have to have stabilization at the same time. But I do see when, you know, you're doing multiple apartments or something like that, then that's fine.
Okay. And just this note here, your city or county may also have to see the NOI if they have some sort of permitting authority for the construction projects. All right, now this erosion, sedimentation, and pollution control plan, it's a pretty comprehensive document that has a lot of things that have to be dealt with, which is why I guess they want this done by a design professional. But it includes all of these things. A site description, best management practices for conducting activities on the site, controls and measures to prevent erosion, inspection program. You're going to have to do routine inspections as well as inspections after certain designated rain events, maintenance for the site, sampling requirements for turbidity, retention of records, and report submittal. Certain reports such as turbidity monitoring are going to have to be submitted to EPD on a routine basis. So when you're doing an audit for stormwater, the things you're going to look for are there first of all, ask what is the stormwater collection system on campus? How is stormwater managed? Are there retention basins? Are there catch basins that are just flowing? How many outfalls are they? Where are the outfalls and what are they flowing into? Get copies of the stormwater permits and plans, and as I recommended with the SPCC plans, if you can get these in advance, you're really going to be much better off because that sedimentation control plan can be a pretty lengthy document. And the more you can review it at your leisure before you get on site, the better you'll be. Look for evidence of spills or discharges of pollutants to catch basins or illicit connections. Go out and look at some of these outfalls. If the campus has outfalls that are going to a drainage swale or that are going into a stream or a creek, if you see something blue coming out of the end of that pipe, should be a flag that there's something wrong. That probably should not be coming out of that pipe. That would be an illicit discharge. Construction projects. Are there any construction projects that are disturbing an acre or more? Is the proper permit in place? Is the permit being implemented? Take a look at the sedimentation erosion control plan. Is that being implemented? Do they have all of the inspection records that are required? Is the monitoring being done? And are the reports being submitted to EPD? And we aren't going to get into this yet because nobody is going to have an MS4 permit yet. So, any questions on stormwater? And I would double check because when you're determining whether you're an MS4, there's that criteria that you're in a designated urbanized area or otherwise designated by the permitting authority. So if you're not, EPD can still say, well, you know, for some reason there's some sort of special or sensitive receptor in the area, we want to regulate you. Again, I'm not sure how this was developed, so I can't speak to that. But what I would do is start by going to EPA's website and looking at the Census Bureau map that designates urbanized areas. And that would give you a start to see if for some strange reason perhaps you are in it. And then if not, then really there's nothing you need to do right now anyway because the permit's not in place. But once the permit does come out and it doesn't appear you're in a designated area, then you probably just want to clarify with the regulators whether you need to seek coverage or not.
So just a designated urbanized area or EPA?
Yeah, if you Google it, that should come up, and it's through the Census Bureau mapping.